A crying pitbull puppy, a debilitated mother, and a cold, empty street. It seemed like the end for them both. But then, an elderly man came along and did something no one could have predicted. Get ready for a story of second chances, hope, and the unshakable bond between a man and his rescue. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. The icy wind howled through the empty streets of Pinewood, a small, quiet town where even the busiest corners seemed to hush after sundown. Clarence Walker, a retired carpenter with a gentle demeanor and a heart as weathered as his hands, shuffled through the neighborhood on his evening walk. It was his way of keeping his aging joints moving and his thoughts clear, even on the coldest winter nights. Tonight felt different. The air carried a weight, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. As Clarence turned down an alleyway leading to a shortcut back home, a faint, high-pitched sound pierced the silence. He froze mid-step, tilting his head toward the source. The sound came again, soft, desperate, and heart-wrenching. It was the unmistakable cry of a puppy. Clarence's chest tightened. Over the years, he'd learned to mind his own business, but this wasn't something he could ignore. The cries grew louder as he followed the sound, leading him toward a narrow, dimly lit corner near an old abandoned warehouse. There, among the discarded cardboard boxes and strewn garbage, he saw them. A small pit bull puppy, barely older than a few weeks, huddled close to its mother. The pup's tiny body shook as it cried, its oversized paws trembling on the cold concrete. Beside it lay the mother, her ribs painfully visible beneath her mangy coat. She barely moved, her breaths shallow and labored. Her eyes, dull with exhaustion, flickered open at the sound of Clarence's cautious steps. "Oh, dear Lord," Clarence muttered under his breath. He knelt down slowly, his old knees creaking in protest. The mother let out a faint growl, weak but protective, and shifted slightly to shield her pup. "It's okay, girl," Clarence said softly, his voice trembling with both concern and determination. "I'm not going to hurt you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a half-eaten sandwich he'd been saving. Gently, he broke off a piece and slid it toward the mother, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The mother hesitated but eventually sniffed the offering. With visible effort, she licked the bread, her body too weak to do much more. The puppy, encouraged by Clarence's presence, crawled forward on unsteady legs and began nibbling on the breadcrumbs. Clarence's heart ached at the sight. He had always loved animals, but it had been years since he'd cared for one himself. After his wife passed away, their family dog, Daisy, had been his only companion. When Daisy passed a few years later, Clarence didn't think he had the energy or heart to love another animal again. But now, looking at this fragile duo, something inside him stirred, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "You can't stay here," he said softly, more to himself than the dogs. The wind whipped around them, and Clarence could see the frost beginning to form on the edges of the mother's fur. He knew if he left them here, they wouldn't survive the night. Summoning his courage, Clarence unzipped his thick coat and reached for the puppy first. The little one whimpered but didn't resist as Clarence tucked it inside his coat, cradling it against his chest for warmth. The mother, however, was another challenge. She flinched as Clarence approached, her growl growing marginally louder despite her obvious weakness. "I know you're scared," Clarence whispered, "but I can't leave you here. Let me help." Using his coat as a makeshift blanket, Clarence carefully draped it over the mother and lifted her into his arms. She was shockingly light, her body almost limp. For a moment, Clarence worried he might have been too late, but then he felt a faint breath against his neck, and he knew she was still holding on. The walk back to Clarence's house was long and difficult. His legs burned, and the weight of the mother dog tested his endurance. Still, he pressed on, driven by the soft sounds of the puppy breathing against his chest and the faint warmth of the mother in his arms. When Clarence finally reached his small, weathered home, he kicked the door open with his foot and carefully carried the dogs inside. His living room was modest but cozy, with an old wood-burning stove in the corner that he immediately stoked to life. The warmth spread quickly, and Clarence gently placed the mother on a pile of blankets near the stove. The puppy wriggled out of his coat and plopped onto the floor beside her. Clarence stood back, hands on his hips, surveying the scene. "Well," he said aloud, "you're not much to look at now, but you're safe. That's what matters." The mother let out a soft whimper, and Clarence knelt beside her again. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he murmured. "I can see it in your eyes. You just need a chance." He spent the next hour tending to them. He gave the mother small sips of water from a bowl and found an old can of chicken soup that he warmed up and offered to her in tiny portions. The puppy, now slightly more energetic, explored the room clumsily, its oversized paws slipping on the hardwood floor. By the time Clarence finally sat down in his recliner, the exhaustion hit him like a wave. He watched as the mother curled protectively around her pup, the flickering firelight casting a soft glow over them. Despite their dire state, there was something undeniably hopeful in the way the mother gently nudged her puppy closer, as if reassuring it that they were safe. Clarence leaned back and closed his eyes, a faint smile on his face. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to give up on them. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Clarence's living room, casting a warm glow over the modest space. The quiet crackle of the wood-burning stove was the only sound as Clarence stirred awake in his recliner. For a moment, he forgot about the events of the night before, until he noticed the faint rustling by the blankets near the stove. The pitbull puppy was awake and wandering around, its tiny tail wagging slightly as it explored its new surroundings. Its oversized paws tapped clumsily against the floor, and it paused to sniff at Clarence's old work boots by the door. The mother, however, remained motionless, her shallow breaths the only indication of life. Her frail condition reminded Clarence that their battle was far from over. "Well, good morning to you, little one," Clarence said, his voice raspy from sleep as he slowly stood. His joints protested, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the task ahead. "Let's see about getting you and your mama fed." In the kitchen, Clarence rummaged through his sparse pantry. His fixed retirement income didn't allow for luxuries, but he found a few cans of soup, some leftover chicken, and a loaf of slightly stale bread. After warming the chicken in a pot, he shredded it into small pieces and placed it in 2 bowls, one for the puppy and one for the mother. As he returned to the living room, the puppy eagerly approached him, its nose twitching as it caught the scent of the chicken. Clarence set the smaller bowl on the floor and watched with a smile as the puppy dove in, wagging its tail furiously. "Looks like someone's got a good appetite," he chuckled. But his smile faded as he turned to the mother, who hadn't moved an inch. Her eyes flickered open briefly, and Clarence knelt beside her, gently sliding the bowl closer. "Come on, girl," he coaxed softly. "You've got to eat something. You need your strength." He dipped his fingers into the bowl and held a small piece of chicken near her mouth. After a moment of hesitation, the mother weakly licked the food from his hand. "That's it," Clarence said, relief washing over him. "You're stronger than you look, aren't you?" The morning passed slowly, and Clarence spent most of it keeping an eye on his new guests. He couldn't help but marvel at the puppy's boundless energy, despite its small size and fragile frame. It playfully nipped at the edge of his slippers and tugged on the corner of an old blanket, its tiny growls bringing a rare smile to Clarence's face. But as much as the puppy's antics warmed his heart, the mother's condition weighed heavily on him. Every now and then she would lift her head slightly as if checking on her pup, before sinking back into the blankets with a tired sigh. Clarence knew she needed more care than he could provide on his own. That afternoon, he decided to call Dr. Riley, the town's veterinarian. Dr. Riley had been in Pinewood for as long as Clarence could remember, running a small clinic on the edge of town. Despite not having much experience with pit bulls, Clarence hoped she could help. When Dr. Riley answered the phone, Clarence explained the situation in as much detail as he could. "I found them last night, her and her pup. The mother's in bad shape, Doc. I don't know if she'll make it." but I couldn't leave them out there. Dr. Riley's voice was warm and reassuring. You did the right thing, Clarence. Bring them in, and I'll take a look. Don't worry about the cost. We'll figure something out. Clarence felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't used to asking for help, but in this case he had no choice. Thank you, Doc. I'll be there soon. Gently wrapping the mother in one of his thick blankets, Clarence carried her to his old pickup truck, the puppy following close behind with a curious bark. The ride to the clinic was slow, the truck's worn-out engine grumbling as Clarence navigated the winding roads. Every bump made him glance nervously at the mother, who lay motionless on the passenger seat. When they arrived, Dr. Riley and her assistant, a young woman named Megan, were already waiting outside. They quickly took the mother inside while Clarence carried the puppy. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and hay, a combination Clarence found oddly comforting. Dr. Riley examined the mother carefully, her brow furrowed with concern. She's severely malnourished and dehydrated, she said after a few minutes. It's a miracle she made it through the night. But she's got a chance, right? Clarence asked, his voice edged with worry. Dr. Riley nodded. It won't be easy, but yes. With proper care, she can recover. We'll start with IV fluids and run some tests to make sure there are no underlying conditions. The puppy seems healthy, though. Your quick action probably saved them both. Clarence let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Do whatever it takes, Doc. I'll figure out a way to pay for it. Dr. Riley placed a hand on his shoulder. Let's focus on getting them better first. As Clarence left the clinic later that evening, the puppy nestled in his arms. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The mother was in good hands for now, but their journey was far from over. Walking back into his home, the puppy yawned and curled up in a patch of sunlight near the window. Clarence sat in his recliner, his gaze fixed on the empty blankets by the stove. You're going to have your mama back soon, he said quietly, as if reassuring both the puppy and himself. We're not giving up on her. The house felt quieter without the mother pitbull resting by the fire. Clarence had grown used to the rhythmic sound of her shallow breathing, a subtle reminder that despite her frailty, she was fighting to survive. Now it was just him and the puppy, whose boundless energy filled the space with a mix of hope and chaos. The little pitbull had taken to following Clarence everywhere, its tiny paws pattering behind him no matter where he went. It stumbled over the edges of rugs, tried to climb up onto the couch with minimal success, and gnawed at Clarence's old slippers, as if they were the greatest toy in the world. Despite his best efforts to remain stoic, Clarence found himself chuckling more often than he had in years. "Well, aren't you a handful?" he said one morning, as the puppy tugged at the hem of his flannel shirt. "You need a name, don't you?" The puppy tilted its head, as if understanding the question. Clarence thought for a moment, then said, "How about Buddy? You're already acting like one." The puppy wagged its tail furiously at the sound of his voice, the name seeming to stick instantly. From that moment on, Buddy became the center of Clarence's world. He fed him, cleaned up after him, and even found himself talking to the little pup, as if he could respond. Still, Clarence's thoughts often wandered back to the mother. Every night, he sat in his recliner with Buddy curled up in his lap, staring at the phone, half expecting a call from Dr. Riley. Days turned into a week, and Clarence's worry grew with each passing moment of silence. Finally, on a cold Thursday morning, the phone rang. Clarence snatched it up so quickly, he nearly knocked it off the receiver. "Hello?" "Clarence, it's Dr. Riley," came the familiar voice. "I've got good news. The mother's responding well to treatment. She's still weak, but she's improving." Relief flooded through Clarence's chest. "That's great to hear. When can I bring her home?" "I'd like to keep her for a few more days just to make sure she's stable," Dr. Riley said. "But she's a fighter, Clarence. You gave her a chance, and she's not wasting it." After hanging up the phone, Clarence turned to Buddy, who was chewing on an old tennis ball he'd found in the corner of the garage. "Hear that, boy? Your mama's coming back. We've got to make sure everything's ready for her. The next few days were spent preparing the house for her return. Clarence cleaned the living room thoroughly, rearranged the blankets by the stove, and even bought a new bed specifically for the dogs. He didn't have much to spare, but it felt right to give them something of their own. When the day finally came, Clarence drove to the clinic with Buddy in tow. The little pup sat on the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the window, as if sensing the importance of the trip. Dr. Riley greeted them with a smile when they arrived. "She's ready to go home," she said, leading Clarence into the back room where the mother pitbull was resting. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. The mother was still thin, but her eyes were brighter, and she managed to lift her head when Clarence approached. Her tail gave a faint wag as Buddy barked excitedly, wriggling out of Clarence's arms to nuzzle against her side. "She's going to need time and care," Dr. Riley explained. "But she's a survivor. With you looking after her, I think she'll do just fine." Clarence nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. He carefully lifted the mother into the back seat of his truck, Buddy climbing in beside her, as if he were her personal guard. The ride home was quiet, the weight of the journey settling over Clarence like a warm blanket. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. Back at the house, Clarence set the mother gently onto her new bed, covering her with a soft blanket. She let out a contented sigh, her eyes fluttering closed as Buddy curled up beside her. "You're home now," Clarence said softly, sitting down in his recliner. "And I promise you're never going to have to fight alone again." As the fire crackled and the dogs rested peacefully, Clarence leaned back, a rare smile spreading across his face. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. The days passed in a comforting rhythm for Clarence, Buddy, and Grace. The once fragile mother pitbull was slowly regaining her strength, her coat shinier and her steps steadier. Buddy remained a bundle of energy, constantly seeking Clarence's attention or inventing new games to play around the house. Life felt brighter, warmer, and more purposeful than Clarence had felt in years. But the world outside their small sanctuary wasn't as kind. Clarence knew Pinewood well. It was a quiet, tightly knit town with people set in their ways. Over the years, he had seen how opinions and prejudices stuck, passed down like family heirlooms. For pit bulls, the stigma was particularly harsh, and Clarence was reminded of it one crisp afternoon. Walking through the park, Clarence held Grace's leash loosely in one hand, while Buddy trotted ahead, his stubby tail wagging with delight. The late autumn air was cool but pleasant, and Clarence enjoyed the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. It had been years since he had ventured out with a dog, but this felt right. For a moment, he forgot the wary looks and judgmental whispers that followed him. "Isn't that Clarence Walker?" a voice muttered from a nearby bench. "It is. What's he doing with those pit bulls? I heard they're dangerous. They shouldn't be allowed in public." The word stung, but Clarence kept his gaze forward, focusing on the gentle pull of the leash as Grace walked beside him. She didn't seem to notice the comments, her attention fixed on Buddy, who was attempting to chase a leaf caught in the wind. As Clarence continued, a young girl broke away from her mother and ran toward them, her face alight with excitement. "Can I pet your dog?" she asked eagerly, pointing at Buddy. Clarence hesitated, glancing at Grace to gauge her reaction. Though she had been nothing but gentle at home, he was still cautious about how she might react to strangers. "Sure," Clarence said, kneeling beside Buddy. "Start with him. He's the friendlier one." The girl giggled and reached out, her small hands hesitantly brushing against Buddy's soft ears. Buddy, ever the attention-seeker, leaned into her touch, his tail wagging furiously. Seeing this, Grace stepped forward cautiously, her nose twitching as she sniffed the girl's outstretched hand. After a moment, Grace's tail wagged too. "They're so nice," the girl exclaimed, turning to look at her mother. Can we get one like them?" The mother, who had been watching from a distance with a wary expression, shook her head. "Pit bulls are dangerous, sweetie. They're not like other dogs." Clarence felt his chest tighten, but before he could say anything, the woman ushered her daughter away, throwing one last suspicious glance over her shoulder. "Don't let it get to you," Clarence muttered under his breath, patting Grace's head. "We'll show them. One step at a time." The real challenge came just a few days later. Clarence was raking leaves in his front yard while Buddy and Grace lounged nearby, soaking up the autumn sun. Buddy, now a little bigger, but just as mischievous, chased a fluttering leaf, while Grace lay stretched out on the porch, her head resting on her paws. The tranquility was interrupted by the sharp bark of Clarence's next-door neighbor, Mr. Hargrove. A wiry man with a permanent scowl, Hargrove had never been the friendliest neighbor, but he seemed particularly irritated that morning. "Walker!" Hargrove snapped, marching up to the edge of the fence that separated their yards. "Those dogs of yours are a nuisance." Clarence looked up, resting his rake against the porch railing. "Good morning to you, too, Mr. Hargrove. What seems to be the problem?" "They've been barking all morning, and don't think I don't know what kind of dogs those are. Pit bulls, dangerous, every last one of them." "They're not dangerous, Mr. Hargrove," Clarence replied evenly. "Grace and Buddy are as gentle as any dog could be." "Gentle? Ha! That's what people say until they turn on you. Mark my words, Walker, you'll regret having them around." Clarence took a steadying breath, his patience wearing thin. "You don't know them, Mr. Hargrove. They've been through enough without you adding to it. Maybe if you spent some time with them, you'd see they're not what you think." Hargrove snorted and stalked off, muttering something about irresponsible dog owners. Clarence watched him go, his hands clenched at his sides. He had spent his life avoiding conflict, but he found himself growing increasingly protective of Grace and Buddy. They didn't deserve this. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Clarence sat on the porch with Grace and Buddy at his feet. The day's events weighed heavily on his mind, but the sight of the two dogs resting peacefully brought him a sense of calm. "People can be cruel," he said softly, running a hand over Grace's head. "But we'll show them. You're not just pit bulls. You're family. And family sticks together." Buddy gave a sleepy yawn, curling up beside Grace, who nudged him closer with her nose. As Clarence leaned back in his chair, the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, and he realized something. This wasn't just about proving the world wrong. It was about creating a world where Grace and Buddy could thrive. The days grew shorter as autumn gave way to the chill of early winter, but life at Clarence's home remained warm and full of life. Grace had regained most of her strength, moving around the yard with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there when Clarence first found her. Buddy, on the other hand, had grown bolder and much more curious. His energy kept Clarence on his toes, but the old man wouldn't have had it any other way. Despite their progress at home, the world outside continued to test their resilience. Word had spread quickly in Pinewood that Clarence Walker, the reclusive carpenter, was caring for not just one but 2 pit bulls. While some neighbors offered supportive smiles or cautious greetings, others avoided him altogether. Clarence felt the divide growing, and it only deepened when an unexpected event rocked the small community. It happened one frosty morning as Clarence was walking Grace and Buddy through the park. The air was crisp, and frost clung to the fallen leaves like delicate lace. Buddy darted ahead on his leash, his nose twitching as he sniffed every patch of grass, while Grace stayed close to Clarence's side, her leash slack in his hand. As they rounded a bend near the playground, a commotion broke out. A small terrier had slipped its owner's grasp and was running toward Buddy, barking furiously. Buddy, startled, froze in place, his ears flattening as the smaller dog snapped and growled at him. Grace stepped forward protectively, placing herself between Buddy and the terrier. "Call your dog," Clarence shouted, trying to keep calm as he tightened his hold on Grace's leash. The terrier's owner, a middle-aged woman with a panicked expression, rushed forward and scooped up her dog. "I'm so sorry," she said breathlessly, holding the wriggling terrier in her arms. Before Clarence could respond, another voice cut through the air like a whip. "This is exactly why pit bulls shouldn't be allowed here." Clarence turned to see Mr. Hargrove approaching, his face twisted with disdain. Several other park-goers had stopped to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. "That dog of yours nearly attacked," Hargrove continued, pointing an accusatory finger at Grace. "She did no such thing," Clarence shot back, his voice steady but firm. "Grace was protecting Buddy. Your problem is with that terrier, not my dogs." The terrier's owner looked mortified. "He's right," she said quickly. "It was my dog that started it." "I'm so sorry." But Hargrove wasn't listening. "It's only a matter of time before those dogs hurt someone," he spat. "You're putting this whole town at risk, Clarence." The tension in the air was palpable. Clarence felt Grace press against his leg, her body language calm but alert. Buddy, sensing the unease, whimpered softly and moved closer to Grace. "I've had enough of your nonsense, Hargrove," Clarence said, his voice low and steady. "You don't know these dogs. You see a pit bull and assume the worst, but Grace and Buddy are kinder and braver than most people I've met. Maybe it's time you stopped judging and started listening." Hargrove scoffed. But before he could respond, another voice spoke up. "Clarence is right." Clarence turned to see a young woman standing near the playground, her toddler clinging to her leg. "I've seen him walking those dogs every day," she continued. "They've never caused any trouble. Maybe we should give them a chance instead of jumping to conclusions." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd, and Hargrove's face turned red. With one last glare, he turned on his heel and stormed off, muttering under his breath. Clarence let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked down at Grace and Buddy, who were both watching him intently. "Let's go home," he said softly, giving their leashes a gentle tug. That evening, Clarence sat on the porch, a warm cup of tea in his hands, as he watched the stars blink into existence. Grace lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws, while Buddy snoozed beside her, his tiny snores filling the cool night air. "You handled yourself well today," Clarence said, reaching down to scratch Grace behind the ears. "Better than I did, probably." Grace blinked up at him, her eyes full of quiet understanding. Clarence had always believed that dogs could sense emotions, and in that moment he felt as though Grace knew exactly what he was feeling: frustration, hope, and a deep, abiding love for his two companions. As the night wore on, Clarence's resolve hardened. He knew that changing minds wouldn't happen overnight, but he also knew that Grace and Buddy were worth the effort. They had already proven that with love and patience, anything was possible, and perhaps, with time, the rest of Pinewood would see it too. Winter settled over Pinewood, blanketing the small town in a soft layer of snow. The cold air made Clarence's old joints ache, but he didn't mind. His days were now filled with the sounds of Buddy's playful barks and the quiet strength of Grace, who had become the heart of their little family. Despite the harsh whispers and occasional judgmental stares, Clarence refused to let the negativity dampen his resolve. Grace and Buddy had come into his life when he needed them most, and he was determined to prove their worth, to the town, to himself, and to anyone willing to listen. One morning as the sun peeked over the frosty rooftops, Clarence bundled up in his thickest coat and headed out with Grace and Buddy for their usual walk. The streets were quieter than usual, the snow muffling their steps as they made their way to the park. Buddy, as energetic as ever, bounded ahead, his small paws sinking into the snow. Grace followed at a measured pace, her head held high, and her eyes scanning the surroundings. As they neared the park's entrance, Clarence noticed a commotion near the frozen pond. A small crowd had gathered, their voices a mix of panic and urgency. Curious, Clarence quickened his pace, Grace and Buddy trotting alongside him. When they reached the pond, Clarence's heart dropped. A young boy, no older than 8, was clinging to the edge of the ice, his legs submerged in the freezing water. His cries for help sent chills down Clarence's spine. The boy's mother stood on the shore, screaming for someone to save him. but the crowd remained frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Clarence didn't hesitate. He handed Buddy's leash to a bystander and knelt beside Grace, his hands trembling as he unhooked her leash. "Grace," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, "I need you to help him." Grace tilted her head, her eyes locking with Clarence's. It was as if she understood exactly what he was asking. Without a moment's hesitation, she darted onto the ice, her powerful strides careful yet determined. The crowd gasped as Grace approached the boy. She stopped just short of the edge, her body low and her eyes focused. The boy reached out to her, his small hands gripping her collar as she leaned forward. Slowly, carefully, Grace began to back up, her claws scraping against the slippery surface as she pulled the boy toward safety. The tension in the air was palpable. Clarence held his breath, his hands gripping Buddy's leash tightly. The ice groaned under the weight, but Grace didn't falter. Step by step, she inched closer to the shore, the boy's cries turning to whimpers as he clung to her. When they finally reached solid ground, the crowd erupted in cheers. The boy's mother rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her son and sobbing with relief. Grace stood by quietly, her tail wagging softly as if to say, "It's okay. You're safe now." Clarence knelt beside Grace, his hands trembling as he stroked her head. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a hero." Word of Grace's bravery spread quickly through Pinewood. By the time Clarence returned home that afternoon, several neighbors had already stopped by to offer their congratulations. Even Mr. Hargrove, who had been one of Grace's harshest critics, appeared at the fence with a sheepish expression. "I heard what happened," Hargrove said, avoiding Clarence's gaze. "Guess I was wrong about her. She's remarkable." Clarence smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "She always was. You just needed to see it." From that day on, something shifted in Pinewood. People who had once looked at Grace and Buddy with suspicion now stopped to greet them on their walks. Children asked to pet them, and neighbors brought treats for the two dogs, their fear replaced by admiration. For Clarence, it was more than just a victory. It was a reminder that change, though slow and often painful, was always possible. Grace and Buddy had shown the town what love, trust, and perseverance could achieve. And in doing so, they had changed not only their own lives, but the hearts of everyone around them. The transformation in Pinewood was slow, but it was undeniable. Grace's act of bravery at the frozen pond had shattered the preconceived notions that many in the town held about pit bulls. Now, instead of whispers of fear, Clarence heard words of admiration. Children waved to Grace and Buddy during their walks, neighbors smiled, and even the once critical Mr. Hargrove had softened, greeting Clarence with a nod instead of a scowl. But for Clarence, the change wasn't just external. His life had been irrevocably altered by the two dogs he had rescued. Grace and Buddy weren't just pets, they were family, and their bond had become a source of strength and purpose that Clarence hadn't realized he was missing. The winter snow began to melt, giving way to the first signs of spring. The days grew longer, and with them came new opportunities. One crisp morning, Clarence found himself sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee while Buddy chased a patch of sunlight across the floor. Grace lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, her eyes following Clarence's every movement. A knock at the door interrupted the peaceful scene. Clarence rose slowly, his joints stiff from the morning chill, and opened the door to find Dr. Riley standing on the porch. The town veterinarian was holding a clipboard, her warm smile instantly putting Clarence at ease. "Good morning, Clarence," she said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Doc. Come on in." Dr. Riley stepped inside, her gaze falling on Grace and Buddy. "They're looking great," she said, kneeling to give each dog a scratch behind the ears. "You've done a remarkable job with them." Clarence waved her off modestly. "They've done more for me than I could ever do for them." Dr. Riley straightened, holding out the clipboard. That's actually why I'm here. I was hoping you'd consider something. Clarence raised an eyebrow, taking the clipboard and scanning the papers. His eyes widened as he read the header: Pinewood Rescue and Rehabilitation Initiative. What's this? He asked, looking up. It's a proposal I've been working on, Dr. Riley explained. Grace's story has inspired so many people in town. I thought we could build on that momentum by starting a program to rescue and rehabilitate dogs, especially breeds like pit bulls that are often misunderstood. Clarence blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. And you think I should be involved? Dr. Riley smiled. You've already proven you have the patience and heart for it. Grace and Buddy are living proof of what love and care can do. I can't think of anyone better to help lead the charge. Clarence glanced at the dogs, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The thought of giving other dogs a chance at a better life was overwhelming, but it also felt right. He had seen firsthand the power of second chances, and he wanted to pay it forward. All right, he said, his voice firm. Count me in. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. With Dr. Riley's guidance, Clarence and a small group of volunteers began laying the groundwork for the rescue initiative. They secured a plot of land on the outskirts of town, and local businesses donated supplies to help build the facility. Clarence spent hours hammering nails, sawing wood, and assembling kennels, his old carpenter skills coming back to him with surprising ease. Buddy and Grace became unofficial mascots for the project, their presence a constant reminder of why the work mattered. They accompanied Clarence to every meeting, their wagging tails and friendly demeanor winning over even the most skeptical townsfolk. The facility, named Grace's Haven in honor of the brave pitbull who started it all, opened its doors on a sunny spring afternoon. The entire town turned out for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, and Clarence stood at the center of it all, his heart full as he looked out at the crowd. Dr. Riley handed him the oversized scissors with a grin. This is your moment, Clarence. He nodded, his hand steady as he cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted into applause, and Clarence couldn't help but smile as Grace and Buddy barked excitedly at his side. The first few months at Grace's Haven were challenging but rewarding. Dogs of all shapes, sizes, and backgrounds began arriving at the facility, each with their own story of hardship. Some were strays found wandering the streets, others were surrendered by owners who could no longer care for them, and a few were rescues from abusive situations. Clarence threw himself into the work, spending long days caring for the dogs and overseeing their rehabilitation. He learned to navigate their unique needs, from helping shy and fearful dogs build confidence to providing physical therapy for those with injuries. Grace and Buddy played a vital role, acting as mentors for the new arrivals and showing them that humans could be trusted. One dog in particular captured Clarence's heart, a young pit bull named Daisy, who had been rescued from a dogfighting ring. Her body bore scars from her past, and her eyes held a deep sadness that broke Clarence's heart. She cowered in the corner of her kennel, trembling whenever anyone approached. It's going to take time, Dr. Riley warned. She's been through more than most dogs could bear. But Clarence wasn't deterred. Every day, he spent time sitting quietly outside Daisy's kennel, letting her get used to his presence. He spoke to her in soothing tones, telling her stories about Grace and Buddy and the life she could have if she gave him a chance. Weeks passed, and slowly, Daisy began to trust him. The first time she took a treat from his hand, Clarence felt a lump rise in his throat. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. By the end of the summer, Daisy had transformed. She still carried the scars of her past, but her spirit had returned. She played with Buddy in the yard, her tail wagging furiously, and curled up beside Grace during quiet moments. Watching her thrive was a reminder of why Clarence had taken on this mission. As the seasons changed, so did Clarence. The work at Grace's Haven had given him a new lease on life, filling his days with purpose and connection. The town of Pinewood, once divided over their views on pit bulls, had come together in support of the initiative. Families adopted dogs from the facility, their lives enriched by the love and loyalty of their new companions. On a crisp autumn evening, Clarence sat on the porch of the facility, watching the sun set over the rolling hills. Grace and Buddy lay at his feet, their eyes half closed as they basked in the warmth of the fading light. Daisy sat nearby, her head resting on Clarence's knee. "I think we did good, didn't we?" Clarence said softly, his voice carrying a mix of pride and gratitude. Grace lifted her head and licked his hand as if to say, "Yes, we did." As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Clarence felt a deep sense of peace. Grace and Buddy had saved him as much as he had saved them, and together they had created something extraordinary, a legacy of hope and compassion that would live on for years to come. If this story touched your heart, remember, every life deserves a second chance, whether it's a dog in need or someone looking for redemption. Grace and Buddy proved that love and compassion can overcome even the deepest scars. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes in the power of hope. Together, we can change the way the world sees these incredible dogs, one story at a time.